Hello, my dear listeners. Before we begin today's story, I want to send a warm hug to three very special listeners. Annalisa Quadrelli from Milan, Italy, Sheila Reed from Palm Coast, Florida, and Rosie White from Toronto, Canada. It's such a joy to have you here with me. And what about you? Who's listening right now? Have you told me where you're tuning in from? Leave a comment. I read every message with great care, and who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video too. Now then, let's dive into today's story. The yacht, named the Apex, cut through the dark water with silent, arrogant speed. A faint mist clung to the surface of the sea, mirroring the cold detachment that defined Ryan Winslow's world. He stood on the deck, a glass of champagne in his hand, a sleek, expensive suit clinging to his lean frame. He was on a conference call, his voice sharp and clinical. "I don't care about the sentimental value, Mr. Harrison. The bank foreclosed. It's a number, not a home. We need that land cleared by Tuesday. The Royal Bay Resort project is on a tight schedule. Send the eviction notice immediately." He ended the call, his expression unchanged. For Ryan, the world was a series of assets and liabilities. People were variables to be managed, and homes were merely numbers on a ledger. His success, his billion-dollar empire, was built on this ruthless efficiency. Mark Caldwell, his business partner, approached with a new bottle of vintage champagne. Mark was all false bonhomie and nervous energy, a stark contrast to Ryan's controlled calm. "To the Royal Bay acquisition, Ryan," Mark toasted, handing him a fresh glass. "It's going to be the biggest deal of the decade. We're practically printing money." Ryan took the glass. "To the numbers," he agreed, taking a long, celebratory sip. The champagne tasted unusually sweet, almost syrupy. As they talked strategy, Ryan felt a strange, heavy lethargy creeping over him. His muscles felt slack, his thoughts slow. He dismissed it as the cumulative effect of a stressful week and the alcohol he had already consumed. "You look tired, old friend," Mark observed, his eyes too bright. Ryan tried to respond, but his tongue felt thick. A sudden terrifying clarity broke through the haze. This wasn't fatigue. This was deliberate. He looked at Mark, seeing the greed and fear etched around his partner's mouth. "Mark," Ryan slurred, trying to push himself away from the railing. "What did you—" Mark simply smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Relax, Ryan. You've worked hard. Time for a long rest." Ryan fought the paralysis, his heart hammering against his ribs. He lunged, but the powerful muscle relaxant Mark had slipped into his drink was already taking hold. His legs buckled. He tumbled over the railing, hitting the cold, unforgiving water with a silent splash. Mark watched the ripples spread, then calmly turned and accelerated the Apex, leaving the Billionaire to sink into the dark sea. Miles away, the sea was a churning, violent beast. Annie, her face slick with rain, stood on the deck of her father's small fishing boat, battling the rising swell. She was only 25, but her hands were calloused and strong, used to the brutal honesty of the ocean. "Hold steady, Annie!" Her father, a man weathered by the sea, shouted over the roar of the wind. "We need to get this net in before the squall hits." Annie braced herself, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. She loved the sea, but tonight it felt hostile. She was focused on the net, but a flicker of movement, something unnatural in the churning water, caught her attention. It was a dark shape, too large to be debris, too still to be a fish. "Papa, stop the engine!" she yelled, pointing into the gloom. "There's a man in the water!" Her father, a man of action, cut the engine instantly. Annie didn't wait. She stripped off her heavy outer layer and plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold was immediate, but her training took over. She swam toward the figure, her strong strokes cutting through the waves. When she reached him, he was barely conscious, his head lolling. He was heavy, impossibly so, dressed in sodden, expensive clothes. He was clearly fighting the water, but his movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. She looped her arm under his chest, struggling against the weight. She saw his face, chiseled, pale, and utterly helpless. With a superhuman effort born of adrenaline, she dragged him back toward the boat. Her father helped pull the dead weight aboard. Ryan Winslow lay on the deck of the small fishing vessel, breathing shallowly, his skin clammy. He was alive, but barely. Annie knelt beside him, her own body shaking from the cold and the exertion. She noticed the expensive material of his suit, the gleam of a heavy, complicated watch on his wrist. This was no local fisherman. As the boat finally limped toward the safety of the island shore, Annie looked down at the man she had saved, the man who smelled of wealth and cold detachment. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the water. She knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the sea, that this stranger was from a world that would inevitably clash with her own. Ryan woke to the sound of gulls and the gentle creak of old wood. The air smelled of salt, dried herbs, and something warm and comforting, like brewing tea. His head throbbed, and his muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He was lying on a simple, firm cot, covered by thick, hand-stitched blankets. He tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea hit him. The lingering effects of the muscle relaxant were still paralyzing his strength. "Easy there," a soft voice cautioned. He turned his head slowly. Annie was sitting beside him, mending a fishing net with practiced, swift movements. She looked even younger and more vital in the daylight. Her brown hair pulled back, her eyes the color of warm honey, focused entirely on her task. "You were drowning," she informed him simply, not looking up. "We pulled you out of the water last night. You've been mostly out of it for 12 hours. Ryan's mind, though sluggish, immediately went into crisis mode. He ran a quick inventory. Mark, the champagne, the fall, the attempt on his life. "Where am I?" he demanded, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "The island," Annie replied, finally meeting his gaze. "We brought you to our cabin. You're safe here. My name is Annie." "I need a phone. I need to call the city," Ryan insisted, trying to regain control. Annie shook her head. "No phone lines here, and the cell signal is non-existent. You're cut off, mister." Ryan paused. He couldn't reveal his full identity. If Mark thought he was alive, he would finish the job. "Ryan," he supplied, omitting his surname. "Just Ryan. I'm an entrepreneur. I was betrayed by a partner. We were on a boat, and he tried to cut me out of a deal." He kept the explanation vague, but the core truth, the betrayal, was real. He pushed himself up, ignoring the dizziness, and met her gaze with a desperate intensity. "Annie," he said, using her name for the first time, "I can't go back yet. My life is in danger. If my partner knows I survived, he will try to kill me again. I need time to think, to plan, to understand what he's doing." He appealed directly to her moral compass, the integrity he had already sensed in her. "I need refuge. Just for a little while. When I figure out how to stop him, I promise I will leave. I will go back to my world, and you will never see me again." Annie looked at the sophisticated, desperate man before her. She saw the fear in his eyes, the genuine threat to his life. She also saw the arrogance of a man who assumed he could simply walk back into his life whenever he chose. She sighed, a sound of resignation. "We don't turn away anyone who needs help, Ryan. But you need to understand something. This is not the city. You don't buy your way in here. You earn your keep." "Agreed," Ryan said instantly. "Anything." Annie smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Good, because the first thing you need to do is eat. And then you need to tell me how a man who owns a boat like that ends up floating in the middle of the ocean." Ryan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had bought himself time. But as he looked at the woman who had saved him, he realized he was now trapped by his omission, an omission that was necessary for his survival, but which felt heavy with the promise of future pain. Ryan was utterly impotent. He held his sophisticated waterproof iPhone, which had miraculously remained in the tight pocket of his expensive trousers, aloft near the cabin window. The device, a testament to his obsession with preparedness and control, was intact, but the screen displayed the dreaded, immutable no service message. He tried again, walking the length of the small room, his movements too sharp for the rustic setting. He was the master of communication and instant data, but here, his power was useless. Annie found him pacing the small cabin floor, his face etched with frustration. She was carrying a basket of freshly caught fish. "Looking for a signal?" she asked. "You won't find one. We're too far out. You'll have to rely on the old ways for now." "Old ways," Ryan scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "I solve problems with capital and logistics, not old ways." Annie simply smiled, a quiet challenge in her honey-brown eyes. "Then you have a lot to learn, Ryan." She led him out of the cabin and into the heart of the island community. The contrast with his world was immediate and jarring. There were no towering skyscrapers, only small, brightly painted wooden houses. There were no luxury cars, only bicycles and small fishing skiffs. But what struck him most was the noise. Not the aggressive din of the city, but the sound of human connection. Laughter, children playing, neighbors calling out greetings. Annie took him to the small, sun-drenched clearing where she held her informal classes. A dozen children, ranging in age, were gathered around her, their eyes wide with excitement. "This is Ryan," Annie introduced him. "He's helping us with the fishing nets." The children immediately swarmed her, hugging her legs, showing her drawings, vying for her attention. Ryan watched as Annie, the strong fisherwoman, transformed into the passionate teacher. She spoke about literature, about the power of stories, her eyes glowing with a purpose he hadn't seen in any of his highly paid executives. "I teach them here," Annie explained to Ryan later, as the children dispersed. "The nearest proper school is a ferry ride away. They deserve access to the world, to ideas." "You don't get paid for this," Ryan observed, the habit of transactional thinking hard to break. "No," Annie replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "We do it because it needs to be done. We help each other." Ryan, the man who saw houses as assets, began to see people. He realized that the wealth of this community wasn't in their bank accounts. It was in their connections. He felt a sudden, profound need to repay her, to buy back a piece of his dignity. "Annie," he said, his voice regaining its corporate authority, "I know you don't want charity, but when I get back to the city, I will transfer you a sum of money, a significant amount, enough to change your life, fund this school, and ensure you never have to worry about supplies again." Annie didn't even flinch. She met his gaze, her expression gentle but firm. "We don't save lives for money, Ryan. We save because it's the right thing to do, and we don't accept payment for kindness. If you want to help, you can help me fix the roof on the shed." Ryan stared at her, utterly defeated. He realized that the sophisticated tools he relied on, his wealth, his influence, his control, were useless. He was stripped bare, forced to operate on a completely different set of values. He felt an unexpected, dangerous attraction to Annie's fierce integrity, but it also served as a painful reminder of how empty his own world had become. He was a king without a kingdom, and his only path to survival was to earn his keep in a world where his money meant nothing. Annie, true to her word, put Ryan to work. The first task was mending fishing nets, a task that required patience, dexterity, and a complete lack of corporate arrogance. Ryan, the man whose hands were accustomed only to the smooth glass of a champagne flute or the cool metal of a steering wheel, was spectacularly inept. "You're holding it like a dead fish, Ryan," Annie teased, her laughter ringing out across the small dock. Ryan frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was used to mastering complex financial models in hours, but this simple knot defeated him repeatedly. His frustration was a familiar, unwelcome feeling. "I assure you I am usually very competent," he muttered, pulling the twine too tightly and snapping a thread. Annie knelt beside him, her presence a warm, distracting force. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she guided his hand through the intricate loop. Her touch was rough from years of labor, yet surprisingly gentle. "It's not about competence, Ryan. It's about rhythm," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "You have to listen to the net." For the first time in his life, Ryan felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with a successful transaction. He was physically tired, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar labor, but his mind was quiet, focused entirely on the simple, honest task. He was earning his keep, not with money, but with effort. The proximity, however, was a dangerous variable. Annie's scent, a clean mix of sea salt, sun, and the faint sweet smell of the herbs she used for tea, was intoxicating. They were working late that afternoon, trying to secure the nets before the predicted evening squall hit. They were in a small, isolated fishing shack on the far side of the cove, a place used to store gear and dry lines. The storm hit without warning. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, instantly trapping them inside the small, dark space. The sudden, intense fear of the storm, the raw power of the sea, brought back the memory of the drowning. Ryan's breathing hitched, a familiar cold dread gripping his chest. Annie saw it instantly. She didn't ask questions. She simply moved closer, her presence a solid, grounding anchor. "It's just a squall," she said, her voice calm, though the adrenaline was palpable in the small space. "The shack is sturdy." The fear and the adrenaline, combined with the intense proximity, created a volatile mix. Ryan looked at her, truly looked at her. She wasn't just his rescuer, she was his sanctuary. She was the one who had read his soul and refused his money. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The sophisticated man who had always calculated his moves was gone. There was only the raw, desperate desire for connection, a connection he had never allowed himself to feel. He leaned in, his lips finding hers. The kiss was not impulsive, it was inevitable. It was a deep, consuming expression of admiration, gratitude, and a desire that had been simmering since the moment he woke up in her cabin. Her lips were soft, tasting of salt and the simple life he had come to crave. Ryan pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, deepening the kiss. He felt her response, a sudden fierce surrender that matched his own desperation. Suddenly, Annie broke the kiss, pushing back against his chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her eyes were wide, filled with a beautiful, terrifying confusion. "Ryan," she breathed, her voice shaky. "We can't." He didn't release her. He held her gaze, his eyes burning with an intensity that belied his usual control. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But I have never wanted anything, or anyone like I want you, Annie." The air crackled with the unspoken truth. The physical labor had brought them closer, but the storm had revealed the depth of the emotional current pulling them under. The near kiss in the fishing shack had been a seismic event, shattering the fragile neutrality they had established. The next few days were marked by a charged silence. They worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, each touch sending a jolt of electricity that was instantly suppressed. They were both acutely aware that they were falling in love, a development that complicated Ryan's mission and threatened Annie's world. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the small dock, the air cool and calm, the sky a velvet canvas dusted with stars. The silence was comfortable, a sign of their growing intimacy. Ryan broke the silence. "Tell me about your future, Annie. What do you see when you look at those stars?" Annie sighed, pulling her knees to her chest. "I see the island. I love it here. It's home. But I also see the books, the stories, the world I studied in college. I want to use my literature degree for something more. I want to build a proper school here, a place that connects our children to the wider world." She turned to him, her expression serious. "But that future is under threat. The island is small, and the world is large and predatory." "What kind of threat?" Ryan asked, his corporate instincts immediately kicking in, though his stomach tightened with dread. Annie's voice dropped to a low, passionate murmur. A huge real estate developer. They want to buy up the entire village, force everyone out, and build some kind of luxury resort. She pointed vaguely toward the coast. They've been sending agents, offering lowball prices, using legal threats. They are trying to erase us, Ryan. To turn our home into a playground for the rich. Ryan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew exactly what she was talking about. The Royal Bay Resort. The massive, secretive deal he and Mark had been celebrating on the Apex. "And what are you doing about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Annie's eyes flashed with a fierce, defiant light. "We fight. We have a small activist group. We meet every week. We organize. We try to find legal loopholes. We are trying to raise awareness." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "But we are like ants against an anteater, Ryan. They have the money, the lawyers, the power. But we have the moral ground. We have to fight because if we lose this, we lose everything that makes us us." She looked at him, her passion burning bright. "I know you're a businessman, Ryan, but you have to understand. This isn't just property. This is where generations of families are buried. This is our history." Ryan felt a physical pain in his chest. He was the anteater. He was the man responsible for the destruction she was fighting so fiercely against. He had founded the company. He had signed off on the initial plans for the Royal Bay Resort. He had been so far removed from the ground operations, so focused on the bottom line, that he had never bothered to ask how the properties were being acquired. He had simply trusted Mark to handle the logistics. He realized that Mark hadn't just tried to kill him for the profits. Mark had been operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of the Winslow property holdings, knowing Ryan would never approve of such cruel tactics. Ryan's initial reason for returning, revenge against Mark, suddenly felt small and selfish. Now he had a far greater, more terrifying motivation. Redemption with Annie. He looked at the woman he was rapidly falling in love with, the woman who hated the company he founded. He felt a sickening knot in his stomach. He was trapped. He was falling for the woman who was fighting the monster he created. The next morning, the abstract threat Annie had described became brutally real. Ryan was helping Annie's father, a kind, weathered man, repair a small engine near the docks. Ryan was still clumsy, but he was learning the rhythm of the work, his mind surprisingly clear. Suddenly, a wail of despair cut through the morning air. A woman from the village, Mrs. Elena, appeared on the dock, her face streaked with tears, clutching a small, worn box of belongings. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with profound grief. Annie rushed to her side, immediately holding her. "Elena, what happened? What is it?" Elena could barely speak, holding up a crumpled legal document. "They came, Annie. The officers. They said I had to leave. Today. They said the house belongs to the Winslow property holdings now." Annie's eyes flashed with a deep, righteous anger. She turned to Ryan, explaining the situation, her voice tight with indignation. "This is what they do, Ryan. Elena's family has owned that house for 3 generations. There were no debts, no foreclosure. But the Winslow property holdings uses these aggressive legal tactics. They find some obscure zoning violation, some ancient easement, and force a sale at a fraction of the value. They are buying the houses out from under people who can't afford the legal fight." She pointed to the document in Elena's hand. "They are systematically destroying our community, one family at a time, just to build their damned Royal Bay Resort." Ryan felt a wave of icy coldness wash over him. He looked at Elena, the physical manifestation of the numbers he had always dismissed. He saw the genuine, soul-crushing pain of a woman losing her home, her history, her security. He knew the name on the document. He knew the company. He knew the resort. He was the Winslow property holdings. The realization was a crushing blow. He had always seen himself as a shrewd businessman, not a villain. He had assumed Mark was handling the acquisitions legally, just quickly. He had never imagined this level of cruelty. He realized Mark wasn't just trying to kill him for the money. Mark was using the cover of Ryan's disappearance to implement a scorched earth policy, knowing Ryan would never have approved such unethical, inhumane methods. Ryan, the man who saw people as numbers, felt the full, agonizing weight of his own monstrous creation. He was the anteater Annie was fighting. He looked at Annie, her face contorted with fierce compassion for Elena. He knew that if she discovered the truth now, he would lose her forever. He was not just the man who omitted his identity. He was the source of her community's suffering. He now had 3 overwhelming motivations. 1. Survival. Stop Mark before he tried again. 2. Vengeance. Expose Mark's fraud and attempted murder. 3. Redemption. Save the island and earn back the respect of the woman he loved. He clenched his fists, the metal of the wrench he was holding digging into his palm. He needed to get back to the city immediately. "Annie," he said, his voice low and strained. "This is terrible. You're right. You can't let them win." He looked at Elena, his eyes filled with a pain that was both personal and corporate. He knew he was the monster in the room, and the only way to stop the destruction was to confront the monster's head, which meant confronting himself. He now had to face the terrifying truth. He was falling in love with the woman whose life he had inadvertently ruined. The discovery that he was the unwitting architect of the island's destruction had profoundly changed Ryan. His movements were now tinged with a desperate urgency, his gaze often distant as he mentally mapped out his return to the city. Annie, sensing his renewed tension, tried to ground him in the warmth of the community. She insisted he join her family for Sunday dinner, a sacred ritual in their home. Ryan was hesitant. He felt like an imposter, a wolf in borrowed clothing sitting at the table of his victims. He was afraid the simple honesty of the family would expose his guilt. The dinner was a chaotic, beautiful mess. Annie's grandmother, a formidable woman with kind eyes, presided over the table, serving a massive platter of roasted fish with lemon and herbs. Annie's father shared stories of the sea, and Annie herself laughed freely, her eyes sparkling as she recalled childhood adventures. Annie brought out an old photo album, sharing faded pictures of her childhood. She pointed to a picture of a small wooden shack. "That was my first classroom," she explained. "Before I went to the mainland for college, I taught the younger kids there." Ryan watched her, captivated. He saw the depth of their connection to the land, their history woven into every object, every story. He realized that transforming this place into a sterile luxury resort wasn't just a business deal, it was an act of cultural erasure. The guilt was a physical weight in his stomach. He felt a genuine, profound sense of belonging he had never experienced in his life of high-stakes deals and cold luxury. He was home, and he was the reason this home was about to be destroyed. After the meal, while the family was distracted with clearing the dishes, Ryan slipped away, walking to the small wooden porch overlooking the sea. He stood there, his face somber, looking out at the water that had almost claimed his life, and which was now threatening to claim his soul. Annie found him there moments later. She didn't ask about the business or the city. She asked about his sadness. "What are you seeing, Ryan?" she asked softly, standing beside him. He turned to her, his green eyes filled with a pain that was both personal and corporate. He saw the woman who had saved him, the woman who had taught him the meaning of value. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was a silent confession of everything he couldn't say, his identity, his guilt, his love. "You," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me see things in a way I had never seen them before, Annie. You showed me what's real." He paused, knowing he had to leave immediately before his omission destroyed everything. He couldn't risk telling her the truth now. The shock and the anger would prevent her from helping him get back to the city. He needed her help one last time. He leaned down and kissed her gently on the forehead, a gesture of deep affection, gratitude, and a painful farewell. "I have to go," he said, his voice decisive. "I need to get off this island now. I need your help to get to the mainland." Annie stared at him, her heart pounding. The kiss felt like a promise, but the urgency in his voice felt like a break. "Why the sudden rush?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What changed?" Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate resolve. He couldn't lie, but he couldn't tell the whole truth. "I know what Mark is planning," he said, omitting the part about the resort. "It's worse than I thought. I need to stop him, or a lot of innocent people will be hurt. I need to get back to the city to regain control of my life and my company. I need to do this before he realizes I'm still alive." He took her hands, his grip firm. "I need you to trust me, Annie, just for a few more days." Annie looked at the man who had shared his vulnerability, who had kissed her with such tenderness. She saw the fear for his life, but also a new, fierce determination to do the right thing. She nodded slowly, the decision weighing heavily on her. "Okay, Ryan." Ryan felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a crushing sense of guilt. He was using her trust one last time. He knew that the only way to earn her forgiveness was to fulfill the promise he hadn't yet made, to save her island. The following morning, the atmosphere was already charged with the tension of Ryan's imminent departure. Annie was preparing a large breakfast, her movements sharp and efficient, trying to distract herself from the looming farewell. Ryan was out on the dock, checking the boat with Annie's father, preparing for the trip to the mainland. A fisherman from the neighboring cove, Mr. Silas, arrived early, having just returned from a rare trip to the city. He carried a small sack of mail and supplies, including a recent city newspaper. "Morning, Annie," Mr. Silas called out, handing her the folded paper. "Thought you might want to catch up on the world. Seems the city folk are quite worried about one of their own." Annie took the paper, her heart already beating a frantic rhythm. She unfolded it, her eyes immediately drawn to the prominent headline on the third page. "Ryan Winslow, billionaire real estate mogul, missing, presumed dead after yacht incident." Her breath hitched. The world tilted violently. She stared at the accompanying photograph. It was a professional headshot, cold, impeccably tailored, and utterly familiar. It was Ryan. The name on the headline was the same name on the legal documents that threatened her neighbors, Winslow Property Holdings. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers and landed on the wooden floor. The shock was immediate, but the clarity that followed was even more devastating. She pieced together the fragments of the past weeks with terrifying speed: his expensive clothes, his financial authority, his vague answers about his business. Ryan Winslow, the owner, the founder, the man who signed the checks for the company that was systematically destroying her island. She didn't think about the attempted murder. She thought about the infiltration. He hadn't been hiding from Mark. He had been gathering intelligence. He had been sleeping in her cabin, sharing her meals, kissing her under the stars, all to disarm the leader of the resistance movement. His confession of being betrayed by a partner was a carefully constructed half-truth designed to gain her trust. The tenderness, the shared vulnerability, the kiss. It was all a performance, a calculated move to protect his billion-dollar project. A cold, sickening certainty gripped her. She had opened her heart and her home to the very enemy she was sworn to fight. She snatched the paper up, folding it tightly, hiding the devastating truth in her pocket. She looked out the window. Ryan was walking back toward the cabin, his face animated, a genuine smile on his lips as he discussed the morning's fishing with her father. He looked content, happy. The love she felt curdled into a fierce, burning rage. She waited for him, her body rigid, her eyes blazing with the pain of profound betrayal. The confrontation was coming, and it would be explosive. Ryan walked into the cabin, his movements light, his mood buoyant. He was filled with a fierce determination to return to the city, but also with a quiet joy born of his deepening feelings for Annie. He had secured the boat trip with her father and was ready to leave before the sun set. He stopped short. Annie was standing in the center of the room, her stance rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. The air was thick and heavy, charged with a palpable, dangerous energy. "Annie, what's wrong?" he asked, instantly dropping his cheerful demeanor. She didn't answer with words. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled newspaper, and threw it onto the small wooden table between them. The paper unfolded, revealing the headline and his photograph. Ryan Winslow, bilionario do ramo imobiliario, desaparecido y presumido morto. Ryan stared at the paper, the blood draining from his face. His carefully constructed wall of omission crumbled instantly. The moment he had dreaded had arrived. "Who are you, really?" Annie's voice was low, trembling with a controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any scream. Ryan knew there was no escaping the truth. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "My name is Ryan Winslow. I am the owner and CEO of Winslow Property Holdings, and I was almost killed by my partner, Mark Caldwell, who thought he could take over the company by declaring me dead." He took a step toward her, but Annie flinched, a sharp, painful movement that stopped him dead. "Don't," she warned, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare touch me." "Annie, listen to me," Ryan pleaded, his voice earnest. "I know this looks bad, but I swear I didn't know about the methods. I knew about the Royal Bay Resort. Yes, it was our biggest project. But I was focused on the numbers. I was in the city, far removed from the ground operations. I trusted Mark to handle the acquisitions legally." He gestured wildly. "It was only when you told me about Elena, about the cruel tactics, about the houses being taken without debt. That's when I realized Mark was operating a criminal enterprise under my name. He was using my company to destroy your home." Annie laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that tore at Ryan's heart. "You expect me to believe that? The billionaire CEO, the master of the deal, didn't know how his biggest acquisition was being handled? You were here, Ryan, asking about our resistance, asking about the island's weaknesses. You were gathering intelligence. You used my trust, my family's kindness, and my feelings for you to protect your bottom line." Tears of rage and betrayal streamed down her face. "You are the enemy, Ryan. You are the Winslow Property Holdings. You are the monster that is coming to take our homes. You didn't just lie about the company, Ryan. You made me feel like I was special, like we had something real, while you were here studying me. You used my kindness as a tool." Ryan felt a crushing weight of guilt. He saw the genuine pain in her eyes, the devastation of her trust. He knew no words could possibly suffice. "I know you don't believe me," he said, his voice raw with despair. "And I don't blame you. But I swear on everything I've learned here, everything you taught me, that I am going back to stop him. Not just to save my company, but to save your island." He looked at her, his gaze intense, desperate. "I will prove it to you, Annie. I will return to the city, expose Mark, and reverse every single illegal acquisition he made. I will undo the damage I unknowingly caused. I will do this, even if it costs me my entire fortune and my company." He took a final, desperate step toward her. "The only way I can prove I love you is by proving I am not the man you think I am. I am going to prove to you that I am not lying. I will go back and fix this, even if it costs me everything." The confrontation had left the cabin vibrating with raw emotion. Annie stood rigid, her arms crossed, the remnants of her love battling the overwhelming evidence of betrayal. Ryan knew he couldn't waste another second arguing. He had to leave before Mark consolidated more power, or worse, sent someone to finish the job. "I need your father to take me to the mainland now," Ryan stated, his voice now purely focused on logistics. "I need to move fast." Annie remained motionless, her eyes cold and distant. "Why should I help the man who is trying to destroy my home?" "Because if you don't, Mark wins," Ryan countered, appealing to her activism. "He will continue the acquisitions, and the resort will be built. I'm the only one who can stop him from the inside. I need to be alive, and I need access to my company's records. Your father is the only way I can get off this island discreetly." Annie hesitated. She looked at the newspaper, then at Ryan. The logic was sound, but the risk was immense. She was gambling her community's future on the word of a man who had just lied to her for weeks. Finally, she nodded, a slow, agonizing movement. "I'll talk to Papa. But I'm doing this for Elena, for the island, not for you." She refused to look at him again. She went to find her father, leaving Ryan alone to gather his few belongings. The departure was silent and strained. Annie's father, a man of few words, looked at Ryan with a mixture of suspicion and pity, but he honored his daughter's request. Annie stood on the dock as the small fishing boat pulled away. She watched Ryan, who was standing in the stern, looking back at her. The distance was already too great for words. She refused to wave. She refused to show any sign of weakness. Just as the boat rounded the cove and disappeared from sight, Annie noticed a small folded piece of paper tucked under a coil of rope near where Ryan had been standing. She rushed forward and snatched it up. It was a note written on a torn piece of paper, the handwriting sharp and determined, the handwriting of the man who saw numbers and contracts. She opened it, expecting a final, desperate plea of love. Instead, the note contained only a single, stark promise. "Annie, I am not asking for your forgiveness, and I am not asking for your love. I am asking for your patience. I will return the island. I will ensure that every single home taken by Mark is legally and financially restored to its rightful owner. I will also ensure that no one ever again can touch this place. This is not a declaration of love. It is a contract of honor. Hold me to it." Annie clutched the note, her knuckles white. He hadn't promised to call. He hadn't promised to come back for her. He had promised to save the island. The promise was cold, logical, and utterly in character for the man she knew, yet it was the most romantic gesture he could have made. It was a promise of redemption, a contract of action. She didn't know if she believed him, but the note gave her something to hold on to, a fragile hope that the man she had fallen for was real, and that the monster she feared was merely a mistake he was determined to correct. The city was a jarring assault on Ryan's senses. The noise, the pollution, the aggressive speed of life. He felt alien, his skin still smelling faintly of salt and fish, his mind still operating on the slow, honest rhythm of the island. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who knew he was being hunted. He spent 48 hours in a secure, anonymous location, gathering undeniable proof of Mark's actions. He used his deep knowledge of the company's internal accounting and the information Annie had provided about the illegal acquisitions. Meanwhile, Mark Caldwell was having the best week of his life. Mark was chairing an emergency board meeting at the Winslow Property Holdings headquarters, his face smug, his tone authoritative. "As we all know," Mark announced, tapping a pen against the mahogany table, "Ryan Winslow is legally presumed dead, a tragic accident. I have secured the necessary documents to assume full control, and the Royal Bay Resort project can now proceed without his sentimental interference." He was about to sign the final declaration when the massive oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every head in the room turned. Ryan Winslow stood in the doorway. He was thinner, his suit rumpled, his hair slightly longer than usual, but his eyes, those intense green eyes, were colder and more determined than ever before. He looked like a man who had literally returned from the dead. Mark's face went white, the blood draining instantly. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Ryan," Mark stammered, scrambling to regain composure. You're alive. A miracle." Ryan didn't smile. He walked into the room, his presence instantly reclaiming the space. He didn't confront Mark with accusations of murder. He confronted him with facts. "It was no miracle, Mark," Ryan said, his voice low and steady. "It was a failed attempt at murder, thanks to a high dose of muscle relaxant in my champagne. A dose that, according to the toxicology report I had prepared this morning, matches the compound you ordered for testing purposes last month. The board members gasped. Ryan didn't stop there. He used the information Annie had given him, exposing the true nature of the Royal Bay Resort acquisitions. He presented irrefutable evidence of Mark's fraudulent shell companies, the illegal coercion used against the island residents, and the corporate malfeasance. Mark wasn't just trying to kill me for control, Ryan stated, looking directly at the board. He was trying to cover up a massive corporate fraud that would have destroyed this company's reputation and landed us all in prison. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Mark was immediately detained, his reign of terror over. Ryan had won. He had his company back, his life back, and his revenge. He sat alone in his luxurious, silent office that evening, looking out at the glittering skyline. He had achieved total victory, yet he felt an overwhelming emptiness. The victory was hollow. He had saved his empire, but he had not yet saved the island, and he had not yet saved his relationship with Annie. He had proven his innocence to the world, but not to the one person who mattered. He had won the battle, but the true war, the war for his own redemption, was just beginning. Ryan was back in his element, but the environment felt suffocating. His luxurious office, once a symbol of his achievement, now felt like a sterile prison. The familiar scent of expensive leather and polished wood only reminded him of the salt air and the honest labor of the island. He spent the next week working with a single, relentless focus, fulfilling the promise he had made to Annie. His goal was no longer profit, it was restitution. He initiated a massive internal audit, exposing every illegal tactic Mark had employed. He worked with his legal team, not to defend the company, but to dismantle the injustice. The first step was the most painful, a direct reversal of years of his own ambition. He signed the documents that legally returned all the properties acquired in the island community back to their original owners, free and clear of any debt or legal claim. He used company funds to cover the costs, a move that cost the Winslow property holdings millions. His board members were in an uproar. "Ryan, you're destroying the balance sheet. You're giving away assets." "These were not assets," Ryan stated, his voice cold. "They were stolen homes. We are correcting a wrong." But the biggest sacrifice was yet to come. Ryan knew that simply returning the homes was not enough. The threat of future development, of another corporation trying to build the Royal Bay Resort, would always loom over the island. He worked tirelessly with environmental lawyers and local authorities. He used his influence, his connections, and his remaining capital to push through a radical proposal. He signed the final document that legally designated the entire island community and its surrounding waters as a protected national forest and marine reserve. This act effectively killed the Royal Bay Resort project forever. It destroyed the potential for billions in future revenue. It was the complete and total demolition of the core business model he had spent his entire adult life building. He had destroyed his own business empire to protect the island. He sat back in his chair, exhausted but strangely at peace. He had fulfilled the first part of his contract of honor. The news hit the city like a bomb. Headlines screamed about the Billionaire's bizarre corporate suicide and the Winslow reversal. On the island, the news arrived slowly, carried by the returning property deeds and the official government declaration. Annie was in her small classroom when her father rushed in, his eyes wide with disbelief, holding the legal papers. "Annie, look! Elena's house. It's hers again. And the government. They declared the whole island protected." The community erupted in celebration. The anteater had been defeated. Annie stood amidst the joyful chaos, clutching the crumpled note Ryan had left her. "I will return the island, and I will ensure that nobody else can touch this place." He had done it. He hadn't just returned the homes. He had ensured the island's future. He had destroyed his own life's work to keep a promise to her. A profound realization washed over her. The man who had omitted his name was not the monster she had feared. He was a man capable of colossal mistakes, but also of colossal redemption. The anger was replaced by a deep, overwhelming sense of awe and love. He had proven his innocence to the world, but more importantly, he had proven his love to her through the only language he knew: action and sacrifice. Ryan had won the corporate war, but the silence of his victory was deafening. He had saved the island, but he was utterly alone. He was now the undisputed CEO of the Winslow Property Holdings, but the company's focus had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer interested in maximizing profit. He was interested in maximizing purpose. He sat in his penthouse, the vast windows overlooking the city he had once conquered. He had everything back: his wealth, his power, his life, yet the space felt cold and hollow without the warmth of Annie's presence. He tried to call her. He tried once, then twice, then a dozen times. She never answered. He understood. Redemption wasn't automatic. It had to be earned through patience and proof. He realized that his grand sacrifice, destroying the Royal Bay Resort project, was only the first step. He had proven he wasn't a villain, but he hadn't proven he was a partner. Ryan decided that money would no longer be his focus, but his tool. He liquidated a significant portion of his personal assets and dedicated the funds entirely to the island. He established the Winslow Community Fund, focused on sustainable development. He didn't just donate money, he invested in people. He financed the construction of a proper, modern school facility, complete with internet access and a library. He funded a project for sustainable fishing and ecotourism, creating new, honest jobs for the islanders. He was investing in the future of the community that had saved him, channeling his genius for logistics and capital into a purpose that finally felt meaningful. He was investing in people, not in assets. He knew he couldn't simply show up on the island as the returning hero. He had to give Annie time to process the betrayal and the redemption. But the waiting was agonizing. He would often find himself staring at the sea, remembering the salt on her skin, the sound of her laughter, the fierce integrity in her eyes. One crisp afternoon, Ryan made a decision. He had done all he could from the city. He had fulfilled the terms of his contract of honor. He had proven his change was permanent. He booked a private seaplane, not for a grand entrance, but for a discreet drop-off. He packed a small bag, leaving behind his expensive suits and his corporate armor. He was traveling to the island, not as the billionaire who had saved them, but as the man she had saved from the sea. He was going to face her, stripped of his power, and hope that the man she had fallen in love with was still there, waiting for him. Annie was on the beach, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sand. She was sketching designs for the new school library, a project now fully funded and underway thanks to the Winslow Community Fund. The island was thriving. The fear was gone, replaced by a vibrant hope and a renewed sense of community. She felt a deep, quiet gratitude for Ryan. He had kept his promise. He had proven his love through action, sacrificing his empire for her home. Yet, the betrayal still lingered, a scar on her heart. She hadn't allowed herself to contact him, knowing that the final step in their journey had to come from him. Suddenly, a small seaplane appeared, landing gently on the water in the cove. It was discreet, unlike the massive yachts that usually frequented the area. A figure emerged from the plane and waded ashore. Annie froze. It was Ryan. He was wearing simple, well-worn clothes, a faded blue shirt and canvas trousers. He carried no briefcase, no expensive watch, no corporate armor. He looked thinner, his face weathered by stress and lack of sleep. But his eyes, those intense green eyes, were focused entirely on her. He stood on the sand, a few feet away, making no move to approach until she gave him permission. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire. He was just a man, vulnerable and exposed. Annie dropped her sketchbook and ran. She ran not away from him, but to him. She covered the distance between them in a desperate sprint, throwing herself into his arms. Ryan caught her, holding her tightly, burying his face in the familiar scent of salt and her hair. He felt her small, strong body pressed against his, and the emptiness he had carried for months finally dissolved. "You came back," she whispered into his shoulder, tears wetting his shirt. "I promised," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I fulfilled the contract of honor." She pulled back slightly, her hands framing his face. She looked at the man who had destroyed his life's work for her. "You destroyed the project of your life," she said, her voice filled with awe. Ryan looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't just save me from the sea, Annie. You saved me from myself. I was drowning long before I fell off that yacht. I was drowning in numbers and greed. You showed me what real value is." He took her hands in his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I didn't destroy the project of my life, Annie," he corrected, his voice firm. "I rebuilt it. I rebuilt it around purpose, around community, and around you." He slowly knelt down on the sand, ignoring the sharp shells and the wet grit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple velvet box. "I came here to fulfill the final clause," he said, his eyes shining with love. "I don't have a corporate proposal this time. I have a genuine one." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring. "I want to be your partner, Annie. Not in business, but in life. I want to build a future here, with you, where we measure success not by profit, but by the laughter of children and the strength of our community." He looked up at her, his heart laid bare. "Will you marry me, Annie? Will you give me a lifetime to prove that the man you saved is the man you deserve?" Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were bright with certainty. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, Ryan. I will marry you." He stood up, sliding the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt, redemption, and the promise of a life built on solid ground. 2 years later, the island was unrecognizable, yet perfectly preserved. The Winslow Community Fund had transformed the village. The new school, a bright modern building designed to blend with the landscape, was a hub of activity and had become a model for rural education across the state. The sustainable fishing and tourism projects ensured that the community was thriving, not just surviving. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the entire island community was gathered for a celebration. The first birthday of Lily, Ryan and Annie's daughter. Ryan, no longer the cold, impeccably dressed CEO, was on his knees in the grass, his shirt stained with cake frosting, trying to coax a giggle from his daughter. He was fully present, his laughter genuine and unrestrained. Annie watched him from the porch, her heart full. He was still a powerful man, but his power was now channeled into nurturing and protecting what he loved. He was a man who had found his purpose. Later, as the party wound down, Ryan took Annie's hand and led her away from the noise, toward the secluded cove where he had almost drowned. They stood at the water's edge, the setting sun painting the sky in soft hues. "Do you remember what I told you on the apex?" Ryan asked, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "That you were celebrating the biggest deal of the decade," Annie replied softly. "Exactly," he said. "I thought success was measured by the size of the acquisition. I thought the Royal Bay Resort was the pinnacle." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it made her breath catch. "I was wrong. The biggest deal I ever closed wasn't real estate. It was the contract of honor I signed with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object, the expensive, complicated watch he had been wearing when he fell into the sea. "This used to measure my life, minutes, hours, deadlines. Now it's just metal." He dropped it into the sand. "You," he continued, placing his hand over her heart, "you measure my life in purpose, in connection, and in love." He looked toward the horizon, then back at the island, at the thriving school, the busy docks, the happy homes. I used to see people as numbers and money as the only metric. Now my greatest asset is the laughter of our daughter, the strength of this community, and the fact that I get to wake up next to the woman who taught me how to live." He kissed her, a long, tender kiss that held the promise of forever. Ryan Winslow was no longer the arrogant, cold billionaire. He was a husband, a father, and a man who understood that the true wealth of life lies not in what you own, but in who you love and what you build together. The island, once his biggest liability, had become his greatest redemption and his eternal home.